Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. I hope all the listeners out there are doing fantastic as well. The guest that we have on, he's been here a few times already, and we always have a good time with him. He's always such a wealth of information, but he delivers it in such a way that I think anybody can understand it, and damn handsome. But Tim, before we get to our guest, how are you today?
I am doing great over here. Thanks a lot for asking. And yeah, I am excited to once again announce our guest, Matt Murphy of mattmurphylaw.com, and he's a new author. He wrote a great book called The Book of Murder. It's out now. You can check it out. In this episode with him, this is now the third time we've spoken with Mr. Matt Murphy, Lance, and we spoke more about his book in the first two conversations, The Book of Murder, but in this third conversation, we speak a little bit about his next book. And in this conversation, we speak mostly about serial killers and, from his perspective, what it was like to try them as a former homicide prosecutor from Orange County. He tried Rodney Alcala, the serial killer. And so we spend a good maybe 20 minutes or so speaking about Rodney Alcala. And really the second half of the conversation is about the Long Island serial killer, or I should say the alleged Long Island serial killer, Rex Heuermann.
And Matt is such a great person to sit down with and speak about these crimes and the people who perpetrate them because, like you said, he was a prosecutor and he has been involved in these situations where he has to sort of think like them, manipulate alongside them with their minds and his own mind in order to get the information that they need. And all of that goes into these insights when he writes his books. And I'm so excited that he's got this new book that is just specifically focused on serial killers, because not only does he talk about them and their crimes and how to make yourself aware of their presence, but I'm sure there's pieces in there that will set you up to protect yourself in some way.
And Matt definitely has a genuine curiosity about the minds of serial killers. You can tell because the way he speaks about them, he almost gets excited speaking about their psychology and, you know, how they hold trophies and how there are patterns with serial killers that repeat in different serial killers. And I think that's one part that Matt really likes about it because, I mean, after all, he was a prosecutor, so that's like evidence, right?
Right, and he loves catching them. I think that's the ultimate icing on the cake, which is I'm going to learn about you, I'm going to learn about your patterns, I'm going to figure out how to use all of that against you, and that's why he's a prosecutor, and he catches them, and I think that's a lot of where that excitement that you spoke about comes from, is watching them be a victim of their own MO.
Right. Okay, so we hope you enjoy this conversation with Matt Murphy. Definitely check out his book, The Book of Murder. You can get that online. And check out his website, mattmurphylaw.com. Make sure to follow us on social media at MissingCSM.
And be sure to stay tuned. At the end of the episode, Tim and I will be coming back in with our final thoughts on this conversation.
We're going to break quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the podcast. Matt Murphy, how are you today?
Good. It's a sunny but cold day here in New York City.
Yeah, same. We got sunny and cold, had a few flurries of snow. You guys got kind of dumped on, though, didn't you?
Yeah, pretty crazy. But today's actually a beautiful day. It's just very cold. My California blood it's kind of at its limit. Got to be 19 last night, and I went outside and turned right back around and came back inside.
Yeah.
So
gotta get that blood thickened up again, I guess.
Yeah, or something. I have a neighbor, and I ran into her on the elevator that I'm like, I cannot believe how cold it is. And she's like, I'm from the Midwest. I'm like, oh, I almost died. She was like laughing at it because it was nothing for her.
Well, having you on the show is not nothing for us. This was actually the only thing on my New Year's resolution list was to have
Oh,
you back
nice.
on. Yeah, have you back on Crawlspace, so I can check that off my New Year's goals.
Well,
In the
happy to
first,
help.
yeah, thank you. Right in the first week. You are super famous. You're known by millions, but there's like 2 or 3 people who don't know you. So can we do the whole who you are and where you're from?
Sure. I'm famous with my sister. That's about the only person that thinks I'm really famous. So yeah, my name's Matt Murphy. I was a deputy DA in Orange County, California for 26 years. I spent 21 years in the sexual assault and homicide units. I just wrote a book called The Book of Murder, where I go through the taxonomy of different murder cases that I encounter, from child abuse cases to serial killers, conspiracies to kill for money, and sort of everything in between. And I also work as a legal analyst for ABC News here in New York, which is mostly doing breakdown of the cases of the day, which is a lot of fun. And I'm in private practice, mostly defending police officers in Los Angeles and Orange counties in Southern California. So that's me.
I want to ask about the Book of Murder. It's one of the best true crime books I've read in years. And you mentioned that you were considering a second book. Any news on that yet?
Yeah, so thank you for asking. Yeah, I just submitted a proposal to my agent yesterday, as a matter of fact. And the working title, it's specifically about serial killers. So among the serial killers I prosecuted, I prosecuted 13 different people that would qualify under the FBI definition, I think. But some of the more notable ones were the Golden State Killer. I was the Orange County prosecutor on that case. I had Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer. I, of course, had Skylar De Leon, although technically he's a serial killer. I think he's actually a different kind, but he was the Tom and Jackie Hawks yacht murder. I had a bunch of like notable sort of high profile, serial killer guys that I prosecuted, and one woman during my tenure, and learned a bunch. So the next book is right now the working title. It's this is just a working title, but it's Serial Killers Are Assholes is the working title, and
Keep it.
kind of my own personal journey learning about them, what they're like, and it's actually very interesting. So going from sexual assault into the homicide unit, when I showed up in homicide, I thought serial killers were all going to be like Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, like some tortured, abused outcast living in a creepy house on the hill, driving around in a creepy van. And what I discovered when I actually started dealing with these guys is they were just like the serial rapists that I'd just been prosecuting in sexual assault. They were incredibly arrogant. They were sadistic. They were cruel. And what was really interesting to me is that they were vastly socially successful. They were graduates. They had college degrees, a lot of them. They were successful in business. They were successful in marriage. They were successful in school. They had friends. Rodney Alcala, for example, he was handsome. He had a genius level documented Mensa level IQ. He grew up in a house with a loving mom and a loving aunt. His brother went to West Point and was a war hero. Like, he had incredibly successful siblings. I prosecuted another guy named Andrew Urdialis, who was the same thing. One of his sisters became a police officer. No abuse at all for either one of those guys, which really, that is actually, in my experience, and it's counterintuitive because it's almost comforting to think that serial killers are victims of abuse. And they are largely not. And even the ones that were abused, when you dig into it a little bit, I've got a chapter on this in the new book I'm working on, like Eileen Wuornos from Florida. She was a female serial killer, killed 7 men, probably more. But I have no doubt that she was abused as a child. She had a horrific childhood upbringing, but she just wasn't abused by any of the men she killed. And again, there's another one, Edmund Kemper. He's very famous. He actually formed the basis of some of the characters in Silence of the Lambs. He was in Santa Cruz, killed 6 women and 1 girl in the early 70s, and same sort of thing. Like, he had a horrifically alcoholic, abusive mother, and that's well documented. However, they didn't get divorced until he was in his early teens, I think, and he had a father who loved him dearly And long before the parents got divorced, he was killing neighborhood cats and family cats. So it's, I figured I did one chapter on Alcala in the last book. So I figure it's worth a deeper dive. And they have patterns. And one of the things these guys love to do is they love to represent themselves. So you deal with them in what's known as pro per status, where you really have to get to know these guys because you'll be in trial with them for 6 months at a time. Like Rodney Alcala's case went on forever. Ernie Alice went on forever. But Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer who Anna Kendrick just famously, she made a movie out of one of the chapters in the book of Murder. Well, based on that case, I had to deal with him in trial as he represented himself. So every day for about a year and a half, I would have a conversation with Rock and Rodney Alcala, and it was a fascinating, sort of descent into the mind of the modern American serial killer. So I figure I have enough stories to share for another book, and I hope people will like it.
You had to be in court with a serial killer who was defending themselves. Is there any part of you that finds that like so absurdly comical? I know it's such a serious thing to do, to be in court and having to like be a part of this trial, but is there somewhere deep inside of you where you're like, this is just absurd? Like, who am I talking to?
Abjectly absurd. And I'll throw another layer on it. In order to, we've got in that case we had the families of 5 different victims that were in court. So you've got, on any given day, you've got over a dozen people that are depending on you to bring justice. As corny as that sounds, it's really true. And there's a bunch of them from the mid 70s, women they killed in Los Angeles County. And we were prosecuting a 12-year-old girl named Robin Samso. And so the goal is to move the trial along, and somebody who's representing themselves can really gum up the gears, as I'm sure you can imagine. So I had co-counsel Gina Satriano from Los Angeles County, who is one of my best friends and wonderful. And my job was basically to be the get along guy with Alcala, and then we would just blame her and try to take advantage of some of his misogyny. Like, hey, I know you want this ridiculous thing, Rod. I would too if I were you, but she said no, buddy. I don't know what else to tell you. So we had to sort of do that constructively. And as a prosecutor, you have an ethical obligation to treat them fairly, even though they're your own lawyer. And that's a sacrosanct obligation of any prosecutor. Like, you have to, above all, you have to be fair. But we're doing that with the idea that we want him to be executed. Now, California with Gavin Newsom and all the rest there, we've had a moratorium. It's not like they're ever going to actually execute the guy, but that's the process that we were in. We were trying to put him back on death row where he'd been sent twice before. And so we're getting along, and it's like I'm trying to get him to cooperate in his own death, basically. And it is absurd. And but what's even more absurd is when he has a right to discovery. So one of the things that he did was he was taking photos of his victims in death. So he was a professional photographer, and he'd go pose their bodies. And that was when they were discovered. They were discovered in these post-rape positions. And because he was so high profile, he had his own cell in the jail. And as his own lawyer, he had to have access to those images. So you can just picture what that guy's doing in that cell at night with those images. Like, we basically gave him his own porn supply, his own created porn supply. And, and it's again, fairness to a criminal defendant is sacrosanct, but it does reach levels of absurdity when you're dealing with serial killers.
That is wild. And the serial killers that you've come in contact with through your work, it's all a sexual thing for them?
That is actually a great question, and thank you for asking that. Okay, so the FBI definition of what a serial killer is 2 or more victims killed by the same perpetrator unlawfully in different events. Okay, so the definition of serial killer as a term is not a legal term. It's an academic, law enforcement sort of pop culture term. So that definition is anodyne from my perspective. It is so broad. That includes medical professionals that are doing mercy killings. Like, we've heard of those every once in a while, or a gang member that stays out of prison long enough, but is actively, quote unquote, putting in work for his hood, and can shoot straight, or a drug dealer that does it long enough, or a cartel guy that is one of their enforcers. So that it's such a broad definition. The real true blue serial killers, in my view, are the sexual predators. The first academic attempt to really get a handle on these guys was a book written by Dr. von Kraft-Ebing. He was a German psychiatrist who was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud back in the 1800s. In the 1880s, he wrote this book called Psychopathia Sexualis, I think is what the title was. And it's called, it basically, it's sexual psychopaths. He attempted to he called them sadistic lust murders. And this is in Germany. I thought, like a lot of people, that serial killers are like a product of modern America, and they are not. That's one of the many myths surrounding serial killers. They've been around for as long as there have been people and civilizations. There's a certain percentage. The American Psychological Association estimates that up to 1% of the human population could be diagnosed as having psychopathy. And up to 30% of the population, according to the APA, have psychopathic traits. Now, certainly all psychopaths, I mean, a lot of psychopaths who don't kill people, the traits are like grandiosity, egocentricity. They tend to be highly charming, highly intelligent. All those traits we see with like a Ted Bundy or a Rodney Alcala, they apply very well in a business context. Like if you have no remorse and you're smart and charming, you can go far in the modern corporate world. So there's plenty of psychopaths out there. We've all encountered them. But those that cross that line into sexual psychopathy, that's a special breed. So in my view, the Jack the Rippers, the Ted Bundys, the Jeffrey Dahmers, the Rodney Alcalas, Randy Kraft is another one in Orange County, which is a case almost nobody's heard of. There's that sexual component, that classic, serial killer, which I think really is its own type, and it's fascinating in a lot of ways. But when you actually have to deal with them interpersonally, when you got to go in and talk about court settings, and you get a sense of just what a-holes they really are, just to deal with them. When you get past the superficial charm, they're also the first to complain about how cold the courtroom is, or how come they're not getting a low-fat diet, and then they tend to sue a lot. And Alcala famously sued the state of California so many times for his own slip and fall, for a low-fat diet and on death row. He reported one of my good buddies to the state bar. He filed a formal state bar complaint against one of the prosecutors on the case because of something that he did. And they're just a-holes. It's a fascinating thing. So especially when you don't know who they are monsters. And if you're, of course, one of the victims, they're monsters. But when you actually have to, prosecute these guys, you start to see this different side of them. And a lot of them are kind of weenies, for lack of a better term. They complain a lot. They're bitchy. It's just you see how everything in their universe the universe revolves around them. The earth revolves around them. They're the center of all being in the universe, and everybody caters to them, which feeds into that. Hey, it turns me on to kill women and rape them, so I'm just going to do it. It's almost, they're born out of entitlement, like an extreme sense of entitlement. And a lot of them, interestingly, not only were not abused as kids, a lot of them were spoiled rotten as kids, which is something that nobody talks about. So I figure I'm going to throw it into book number 2 and maybe add to the discussion a little bit.
Yeah, I love that. And my other question, God, you're a pro. You came right back around to the first question I wanted to ask. Are we starting to get to a point where we, in analyzing serial killers, are weighing the history, their past, a little bit less now? Because we say all the time, that person was abused by their family, so therefore they are going to be responsible for abuse for somebody else. But in some cases, like you just said, this person was spoiled rotten by their family. This person, it's a whole scope of behaviors and incidents that happen when somebody is young. Are we starting to weigh that less heavily? Because a lot of people who are spoiled aren't serial killers, and a lot of people who are abused aren't serial killers. So is there any correlation?
I think we're definitely, your average juror, I think, is gaining sophistication in this area by leaps and bounds. And remember, it's a bifurcated system in California, and Koberger, for example, same thing in Idaho. In a bifurcated system, the jury has to consider what are known as factors in mitigation. So in California, they're called the A through K factors, which is essentially anything that lessens the severity of the offense. So in the penalty phase, so first you have the guilt phase. Did the guy do it? Then you have the penalty phase, where the jury weighs factors in mitigation versus factors in aggravation. And California law is if the factors in aggravation substantially outweigh those in mitigation, they're entitled at that point to vote for death. They're not required to, but they can. That's the way the law works. So the factors in aggravation tend to be their circumstance of the offense and also victim impact under what's known as A factor. And then you can also consider other crimes of violence. So you get into the background that way. But you're absolutely right. It's almost a cottage industry for certain psychiatrists and psychologists who travel around the country who do these deep dives into the background. So there's this built-in life-saving incentive for these guys to come up with instances of abuse because that will be admitted in their favor in the penalty phase. And what I think we're seeing over and over again, you hear it referred to as the abuse excuse, but that's the structural background why a lot of defense attorneys, and it's their job to do it, to pitch, whatever defense. But, I think that, we're seeing less and less death penalty cases in general, especially in California. But, and it's not severity of the case. We're seeing less prosecutors seeking the death penalty. But I think juries are sick of that as an excuse. We saw this to a large extent in the 70s with like the insanity police, 70s and 80s, and they finally passed a law in California that presented obstacles for the defense of not guilty by reason of insanity. It's far more difficult to achieve that now in the state of California as a result of that. I think we're starting to see the same thing now in these bifurcated trials. In California, I don't know. We live in very interesting times right now politically, and today, I'm not sure when this will air, but today these fires are happening in California, and the former DA of Los Angeles County was a guy named George Gascon, who was one of these hard left radical ideologues who managed to win election. And he was, in my opinion, the worst thing for public safety that's ever happened in the history of Los Angeles County, where I grew up. And the voters caught on to that and voted him out. So hopefully we'll see something similar when it comes to violent crime on a statewide level in California. But it seems like I heard a great quote, and I'm going to butcher it recently. It's like history gives us a guide for all things in the future, but the problem is everybody forgets. So it repeats itself. I butchered the quote and I can't remember who said it, but we see that in California, the violent crime. So we'll see this pendulum that swings back and forth. And, with the just historic loss by George Gascon, who's basically an anti-cop, defund the police, everybody goes free. He wouldn't oppose the release of life prisoners when they were up for parole, like murderers and child molesters. He lost so badly in the county of Los Angeles that it almost gives me a little bit of hope that maybe we'll see the pendulum swing back more towards some common sense law enforcement, which we'll hopefully see, I don't know, more death penalty cases for some of these really bad murderers that we see.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
It's always wild to me, just to button that point up, it's always wild to me that it has to be one way or the other. It's either like completely defund and, set criminals free, or it has to be as hard as possible. But like, there's so much nuance to it. The defund the police thing is like so nuanced. Like, there needs to be new training just to be with the times and things like that. I just don't get it.
And it's just, that whole thing is madness. The defund the police thing, and nobody understands the implications of that. And when they do that, they don't cut from, the patrol officers that everybody was so mad at in the summer of George Floyd. What they do is they cut from the gang prevention unit. They cut from the sexual assault unit, which are the detectives hunting down rapists and child molesters. And so when they'll cut detectives, and that's, like all the cases that we talk about, and I'm lucky enough to come back on your show, these are all cases solved by really good detectives. And what happens is when they cut funding for the police department, so those guys just go back out on patrol. So it's like it's like community suicide when they do that. It makes no sense. It's like cutting back on the fire department, which Karen Bass, the mayor of LA, famously did by almost $18 million in the last budget. And now, the Pacific Palisades are burning down as we speak. There's direct consequences to that. And then in the world of violent crime, it's like you can happy, joy it, as one of my friends calls it, only for so long. And then you get guys like Rex Heuermann running around, or these guys that are released too early. And when it comes to rehabilitating your average felon, I'm all for it. If you can get a guy that learns some job skills so they don't repeat, nobody's more reform minded than me. But there's a certain percentage of the population, going back to ancient Rome and beyond, that is just plain predatory. And the math is simple. The more of those guys you put in prison for longer, the less innocent victims you're going to have, especially the serial sex offenders, and the psychopaths that commit those kinds of crimes. I mean, it is like, God help us with some of these guys that want to do the catch and release program or no cash bail. And I'm hoping that we're seeing a sea change and we're going to see the pendulum start to swing back in California, because it's gotten pretty bad.
You mentioned Rex Heuermann, and he's out of New York. And yeah, can you tell us a little bit about this case? So he was recently arrested. He's known as the Long Island serial killer.
This guy is fascinating, guys, and here's why. So this is a lot of serial killers. Your classic serial killer. Remember, they are superficially charming, and they tend to be, for whatever reason, highly intelligent, like Rodney Alcala. And part of that means these guys, number one, this is going to sound weird. There's nothing wrong with their moral compass. They know that this is wrong. They're not. A psychopath is not somebody suffering from psychosis, and the words sound so similar. Somebody who is suffering from psychosis is like somebody mentally ill who thinks that they're the poor homeless people we see that are screaming at trees. Like there's that level of mental illness. A psychopath understands everything they're doing. They just don't care. And they get off on it, and so they're going to do it. And it's a totally different mindset, and they're not worthy of our sympathies. So they don't want to get caught, and they want to keep doing it. And what Rex Heuermann represents, this guy got away with this for years, and he's almost like this Dexter type that figured out a way to defeat much of forensic technology, because they just charged him like a month ago with the latest, Valerie Mack, who's a 24-year-old sex worker. They're making a bunch of these cases on what's called mitochondrial DNA, which is different. When the average person hears they made the case on DNA, we think of nuclear DNA, and you think that's like the DNA that's found in a cell, which commonly in sex crimes, it's the sperm fraction is what it's called. It's found from spermatozoa that's left on or inside these poor victims. And that was the way that, so many of these guys got caught, when DNA came online and the CODIS system went in. But Heuermann figured out a way to leave. I don't think he left nuclear DNA on anything. So there's two kinds. There's nuclear DNA, which is DNA from like saliva, or it's from your nuclear cell that has the genetic component of all, that we all have. The other way is mitochondrial DNA. That's things like fingernails, teeth, and bones. So the numbers on nuclear DNA are crazy. We'll get like 1 in 17 octillion, which is an impossible number even to wrap your head around. But it's so, it basically means there is zero doubt that it's that person's DNA. Mitochondrial DNA, you'll get numbers like 1 in 50 or 1 in 100. So it's not as good. But it's still, when you wrap it in to other, forms of evidence, like in a case like Heuermann, it's still incredibly persuasive on the constellation of evidence. So this guy somehow managed to kill. Right now he's charged with 7. They suspect him of 19 and probably more. And of course, I've got to say, I'm an attorney, so he's presumed innocent. He's entitled to the presumption of innocence. That's critically important. However, boy, the evidence looks convincing against this guy. And it seems like with every new victim, they're releasing just a little more. We've got this trickle of information. So kind of classic example of what we were talking about as far as, somebody that is successful in life. This guy was a successful architect in Midtown Manhattan, not far from where I am right now. This guy was incredibly successful. He had a wife, he had an intact marriage, he had a family, and in his spare time, when his wife was out of town, he was viciously murdering sex workers, allegedly he's been accused of it. But one of the things he is accused of is they got these mitochondrial DNA from hairs from his wife and his daughter on some of these victims. So not even him, which is really fascinating. And what they will layer that with is when they did the search warrant of his home, in a safe, he was collecting trophies, which is another hallmark of every good psychopathic sex offender. They love to collect trophies, and his trophies appear to be newspaper articles. So there would be articles about these things, and he kept those in a safe, which is, I think, devastating for the defense, right? Like, I mean, I've got old articles that I kept from like my early days as a DA, right? Like, like page 28, person convicted of DUI. And as a young lawyer, it's like, hey, my name's in the paper, so you kind of stash those old papers. But imagine that there's a laundry list of women he's suspected of killing in a safe in newspaper articles. So that's very persuasive. There's also some really violent, apparently, pornography that they discovered in the search warrant. But I think one of the most damning things for this guy is that he would allegedly murder a victim, take their cell phone, and then troll their family. And he would take their cell phone and call their family members. So he had a burner phone, like a throwaway phone that he was using that his wife wouldn't be able to see, I guess, to access dating websites and some of these online like sex worker services that he could find. So that was one phone. And then he had his own regular phone that he'd communicate with colleagues, professional phone and family. And then he would have the victim's phone, and you'd be calling the victim's family, heckling them and tormenting them. And all three of those phones would be in his possession, apparently at the same time as he's pinging from Long Island into Manhattan, and having prosecuted a bunch of murders where you have cell phone evidence like that. That's like footsteps on a beach. I mean, that when those guys are able to put that in a courtroom in front of a jury and show where the transponders are for those three different phones and where they're pinging back and forth, I mean, it is overwhelmingly persuasive. So, but he figured out a way somehow to murder all these women and prevent his own DNA from being left on things. So that, I don't think there's any fingerprints, or there might be one hair from him. But there's no, I don't think there's anything, I haven't read anything anywhere about any sperm fraction DNA. So he's doing something to clean them. Which I think represents the new frontier for serial killers. The guys that are going to want to do this are going to keep doing it. It's just they're going to try to figure out a way to defeat, investigators. And I think that's really interesting. So we're seeing he represents one of the very first, in my experience, that is he's evolved to fit, the modern times, which is, I just think it's fascinating.
Yeah, it's really incredible to think about how he got away with what he did for so long, and putting it into the context of he's evolving with the technology and with the times and of the investigations is like terrifying. Is there anyone else like on the radar that comes close to that as far as a serial killer?
Well, we've got, we still have plenty of active serial killers in the United States. There's a really interesting book written, and I'm blanking on the author's name, about long haul truckers and what a perfect profession that would be. And, there's one of the very early techniques that these guys were doing just to get rid of, to kind of get away with it for a long time, was getting rid of the victims' bodies, which would involve burying them in the desert. I had a guy named Andrew Urdialis who's in the Marine Corps. And Alcala did the same thing. The Hillside Strangler, who turned out to be two people working together, Angelo Bono and his cousin, they would dump the victims, like in California, in the chaparral. And, in Southern California, at least, we live on the edge of the Mojave Desert. And, those bushes that you see in the mountains are full of animals. So they will get to those bodies and destroy almost everything of forensic value very quickly. So, that's been going on for years and years. And then, you also see, you also see they're getting better about dumping them in like in the Pacific. We have an unsolved of a sex worker that got washed up in Newport Beach, and it's just that time in the water alone, it will destroy almost any DNA that you can hope to find. So there's definitely they're learning and they're evolving. But Heuermann he was like, you know, wrapping them up in burlap, which somehow must be, you can't leave fingerprints on it, but he had to be gloved up, I think. Or maybe you can't swab burlap. I never had a case that involved that, but that's his MO, his way of disposing of the bodies, which involved brutal amounts of violence and dismemberment and all sorts of things, assuming, he's the guy who did it. But whoever the Go-Go Beach killer is, he escaped, the Valerie Mack was, I believe she was murdered in the year 2000. So it's, 25 years now I can't believe it's 25 years since the year 2000, but, quarter century to put that together. It's really, I think it's fascinating. I really do.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Yeah, and calling the victims' families and taunting them has got to be one of the most evil things that I've heard.
Right.
Is that the same for you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's another thing that, as people want to sort of, one of the most common questions you get prosecuting these guys is, my God, what made him do that? That's what you hear over and over again. And the uncomfortable truth is he made him do it. They want to do it. And that's why he chose to do it. Nobody made him do it, and I mean, you hit the nail on the head earlier. Like, the amount of people that have been sexually abused as children, men and women, is staggering. And everybody has had bad experiences in their lives and hurt nobody, like it's not a vampire bite. When you're abused as a kid or bullied, it's not like, we know what happens when you get bitten by a vampire. We know what happens when you get bitten by a zombie, right? Like, you turn into The Walking Dead. That's not the way it works for childhood abuse. It's just not. And one of the, like in my Andrew Urdialis case, he was targeting primarily sex workers, but not all the victims were. A lot of them were, but he murdered this one woman she had a 11-year-old son. And even though she had a huge drug problem and was working as an escort to deal with that, to get money, she was all this boy had, and in the world. And so his dad wasn't in the picture. His mother was taken away from him when he was 11 by Andrew Urdialis, this horrific serial killer. And he was in foster care, and then he went on, now he's a real estate appraiser, and he was in court every day. And what was really interesting, watching the dynamic of this guy Urdialis grew up in a home with a bunch of brothers and sisters who loved him. He was coddled and spoiled to death as a kid. And he joined the Marine Corps. He was successful there. He's a smart guy. He became a union steward. He had a mother who not only loved him, she probably overloved him, if that's a word. And they tried to blame the mother's drinking when she was pregnant with him, which was not accurate. It wasn't true. And we were able to debunk it, but they went with this fetal alcohol defense. And there in the front row is a guy who grew up in real poverty without a mom because of what this guy did to him. And he was a perfectly productive member of society. So when it came down to his victim impact statement, where he got to talk about what it was like to lose the only person in the world that cared about him, which was his mom, for all of her, horrific faults. He loved him to death, and she was the only thing that kid had going for him. And then he's cast into a foster care system. And I have no idea what the percentages are for kids that are abused in foster care in Southern California, but it has got to be through the roof. And, there've been lawsuits about that, with LA County in particular. But, and he got to testify about his upbringing, and then you contrast it with this guy who had every advantage in life, and it was interesting to see. And the jury had no problem voting death for him. And then what was interesting about that case is he came in, and it's called the statement of allocution, where he came in at sentencing. So he was convicted of five, but he was convicted of three more in the Chicago area. So he was ultimately convicted of eight, murdering eight different women, but certainly killed many more. But he came in and in statement of allocution, the whole jury was there at sentencing, and he said, "I see the jury here." And we argued it like, look, this guy, he got a medal in the Gulf War. He had every opportunity to live this good life, and there were things that were really good that he did that, I had to ask the jury to consider that as a factor in mitigation. It just doesn't outweigh the pain of what he put all these poor families through. And he said, ladies and gentlemen, I see you there in the jury, and I just want to let you know that if I was on the jury with you, I would have voted the same way you did, which was interesting, right? And then but it sounded like he's just blowing smoke. And then I think it was 3 or 4 days later, they transported him to San Quentin, and he hanged himself in his cell and carried out the execution himself, which was really it's a fascinating thing to look at the mindset of somebody like that. And it was almost as if he felt like he finally got a fair trial, because he didn't think he was treated fairly in Chicago, and it was a really odd thing, as far as like looking at the psyche of one of these guys. And usually they're far too egocentric to ever harm themselves, which is another classic trait of these guys, and the arrogance and the egocentricity.
Yeah, right. But isn't that a moment of being arrogant and like owning your own death? Like, okay, I'm not only in charge of the people that I kill, but I'm in charge of my own death as well. That no one's going to be in charge of that but me. And that reminds me, funny story. My sister called me on Saturday. I think it was Sunday morning at like 9 a.m, because she was coming off of this like binge watch of Israel Keyes documentary, and she was so mad that he killed himself. And that's the only reason why she called me. She was like, I just don't even know who else to talk to. I'm so mad that no one got a chance to like find justice, and he took it from them. So I'm thinking, like, do you think that suicide is also just another act of being selfish? And
Might just be. Yeah. I mean, he wound up in a new cell. He was basically a professional death row inmate in Illinois, because he was convicted of these murders in Chicago, and then he was one of the many prisoners on death row that were commuted by Governor Gary Ryan on his way to federal prison. That was sort of his final act out the door. We just saw that federally, with 37 death row commutations in federal, as somebody who's on their way out the door. But I'll stay out of that. But the thing about it, with the families, I think that if those guys suicide, like Epstein committed suicide, I think he did kill himself. I don't know. I don't pretend to be an expert on that, but he did it before the trial and before anybody got their day in court. Ernie Ellis, all these people had their day, and he had to listen to family member after family member. And for sex workers, it's, a lot of people don't realize that, a lot of them really do still have people in their lives who love them, and a lot of those poor people get into it because of drugs, and their lives get out of control, or a little bit of mental illness, and they still have people out there who loved them. So our victims in that case were, they all had family in there, except for one, a woman named Denise Manny. But everybody else had family, and not all were sex workers, but, they were there every day. And it's, when it comes to that, they got their day, and the jury agreed with them. And that's a really cathartic thing for the family, because essentially the jury is making a legal and factual determination that their loved one, despite whatever mistakes they made in their life, was valuable enough as a human being, and their death was awful enough, for lack of a better term, that the person, even though everybody knows in California they're not actually probably ever going to get executed, they still deserve to die for what they did. And that for the family members, believe it or not, it really does deliver a sense of justice to them. And so I think for for that case, for me, the way I wanted to define it as much as I could for those family members was we went through the process and we convinced him. Not only we convinced the jury, we convinced him that he deserved to die, and that's why he did it. And a lot of that is, I guess, it's sort of beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? Like what he really did is he spared those families endless appeals, where they would be challenged for saying this or that in their victim impact statement, and and you see this this entire industry fighting, on behalf of prisoners sentenced in the state of California to death or life without possibility of parole, which is the alternative sentence for special circumstance murders in the state of California, which multiple murder is of course one of those. So I chose to look at it as we convinced him. And I actually think we did on that. And it was weird. He came out and he goes, and I was very nice to his brother and sister. He had two sisters and a brother that testified. And my philosophy on that as a prosecutor is always, it's not the family's fault, and these people, one of them was a police officer, so they'd all gone out and done good in the world and in their lives, and they were nice people. And it's like, I don't want to beat up on them. They came in and it was horrible for them, and they somehow loved their brother despite everything that he had done. And, I can't fault them for that. And so I treated them with dignity and respect. And, he was very angry at the prosecutor in Illinois because the prosecutor really went after them. And I didn't do any of that. And so he came out and he goes, I want to speak first to the DA. He goes, I want to thank him for being so nice to my brother and my sisters that testified, which was kind of weird. And he said, and your PowerPoints were so good. And then he's like, and I see the jury here, and I just want to say that, if I was one of you, I would have voted the same way you did. And it was an interesting thing. And he, one of the victims who survived, a woman named Jennifer S. Benson, she got out of he brutalized her. She just graduated high school, and she heroically managed to get out of the trunk of the car as it was going out into the desert. And it's like a scene out of a horror movie. She's running down the road and he's chasing her with a machete. And a car with two elderly people sees this, and she's all bloody and naked, and they're like wide-eyed, and they kept driving, and she was saved, thankfully. And they're in a very remote part of the California desert at that point. There happened to be another car behind the old couple, and it was two young guys, and they did stop, and he ran back to his car. But that was early 90s, so he got away with it for a long time. And it was horrific. But she described him as just a monster, and having a survivor testify about what they went through, she really spoke for all the other women that did not survive. It's heavy, but it's engrossing at the same time.
And we were talking about families of these murderers, and this Rex Heuermann case and his wife. It's kind of a little confusing because I guess she divorced him immediately, but she also says he's not capable of the murders. Is that some kind of common reaction that you've seen?
Well, yeah, when there's almost always a family member in the picture for whatever reason that just can't believe it, and they will buy into and sort of cling to any defense, however fanciful it may actually be. And so when you look at the phone records in that case, I've read a bunch of the court documents on that, and when they overlap the phone records with her schedule, a lot of these murders were happening when she was out of town. And so her coming in and saying he's not capable, I think we can chalk that up to shock and emotion maybe. And, I would like to believe that she thinks that, because that means that she never suspected him, which, would sort of put her in a category of little to no culpability in her own right. You'd want, I hope that she was completely in the dark, because it's far more disturbing when they're doing this and they've got a family member who suspects but doesn't say or do anything about it.
Him being an architect, I'm curious, do you think that was like that method of thinking, that exacting method of thinking was all part of his character like DNA when he was in his serial killer mode?
Again, assuming he's the right guy,
True.
and
Sorry. Yeah.
again, presumption of innocence notwithstanding, I absolutely think so. I mean that I had I had an old girlfriend who went through her master's program in architecture when we were together. So which is crazy what architects have to go through, and the level of exact physics that they have to conform to be an architect. I mean, 100%, right? It has to weigh in on that. And I can't wait to see what happens with the evidence in that case, because yes, that meticulous attention to detail that's required in that profession would theoretically lend itself really well to somebody who wants to kill a bunch of women and get away with it. So whatever he was doing to make sure that no fingerprints or nuclear DNA was discovered was incredibly successful for a really long time, and there was another factor in this case too. There were allegations made against the former chief of police in the area that these bodies were popping up. And when a new guy came in, and there was a new DA and a new task force, and as soon as the adults came into the room on that case, so to speak, they solved it very quickly, and were surveilling him in a really short period of time, and then soon thereafter made an arrest as soon as they allowed some professionals to actually do the work. But I think we're going to learn a lot more about that and what he was doing to prevent capture. But then again, it's like, you see this over and over again in all kinds of murder cases. The clever ones are 90% genius, or 90, as an old investigator of mine put it, 90% genius or 95% genius and 5% pure dipshittery, right? Like this was his word, dipshittery. And, you've got a guy who goes to all these amazing lengths to not get caught, right? And then he has a safe full of newspaper articles about the murders, and, it's like I think it's probably a function of the arrogance. He's got the body, he's dumped the body. He thinks he's got his bases covered on that, figures he'll never get caught. So, hey, why not keep all three phones on at the same time as he's traveling into Midtown Manhattan, not realizing that he's pinging on every freaking transponder between where he lived and his office for 3 different cell phones, which will be such a convincing graph. I mean, with one cell phone by itself, I had a guy named Alejandro Avila when I was in a homicide. He murdered a 6-year-old girl named Samantha Runyon back in the day, and he traveled from a place called Lake Elsinore in Riverside all the way to Orange County. And it was like when we did the timing of it, and when he's pinging, it was like it couldn't have been anybody but him. And that was just with one phone call. I mean, or with one cell phone. With Rex Heuermann and 3 phones, that thing is going to be tremendously persuasive when that comes out. And I can't wait to see that.
Well, someone told me you make great PowerPoints, so I'm sure you'll.
I thank you. Spend a lot of time on those PowerPoints. I got a couple trials coming up for police officers I'm representing in the new year, and I'm working on one as we speak. So hopefully that one is as persuasive as some of the other ones I did. But
well, thank you so much, Matt, for spending some time here with us today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, hey guys, I love the pod. So I have me on anytime. Any case that comes up. I really enjoy listening to the stuff that you guys do. I'm such a true crime nerd myself that it's one of my favorite podcasts. So I love coming on and have me on anytime, any case, anytime. Happy to do it.
You can keep complimenting. That's cool.
Well, you said my PowerPoints were good, so
awesome.
That's what I heard.
Try to stay warm while you're in frosty New York, and when you get back to California, I hope everything is okay with your property and your friends and everything. And,
yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And here we are back for final thoughts after the conversation with Matt Murphy, former homicide prosecutor and new author. He's so knowledgeable in his field, Lance, and I love speaking about these serial killer cases with him.
I always get so fired up speaking to him because he just approaches this with such enthusiasm, and it's like contagious. In the beginning of the conversation, you can feel it right away. He apparently enjoys coming on the show, which I'm always a big fan of when someone is excited to speak with us, because that just brings out more of my curiosity in the topic. I want to know more about what he's talking about. And I'm always super impressed with people like him coming from a background of prosecuting crimes of homicide, having to see these things, having to see them firsthand, having to see them in pictures, having to hear people describe them must take a toll on you. And he has figured out a way to separate that emotion from the memory. You know what I mean? Like, you remember these things that you've seen, but you can't have that emotion attached to it. You have to detach it and figure out a way to do so. And maybe writing is a way for him to do so, maybe surfing or all of the other hobbies that he does. But I'm always impressed with that. And I think that's an important thing to take from this conversation, is that you can live those lives separately in a healthy manner.
Yeah, that's a good point there, and because it does seem like he lives a very good, healthy life outside of his work, and yeah, man, though his work so fascinating, and I think a lot of our listeners are fascinated by all the stuff he talks about as well. Definitely pick up his book, and man, that second book, "Serial Killers Are Assholes," that is, like, first of all, it's a great title.
Yeah.
Second of all, I can't wait for it. I feel like he's writing it for us and our audience.
Hey, we could just say that here. Ladies and gentlemen, Matt Murphy is writing you a book, specifically you, listener. And it's true, because we have listeners that are just endlessly curious about this. And I love that he came on the show previously a couple of times, and we've talked about a number of topics, and one of them is serial killers. And there's something about serial killers that just is like a barb in his side, right? He just needs to figure out everything he can about this. He needs to solve this, and he's hyper-focused in this particular book coming up. So, I mean, obviously we're going to have him on again, and he's going to talk about the work that he's done for Serial Killers Are Assholes. And it's not just meant to be a funny title, as long as we're just riffing here about this conversation.
Yeah.
He literally wants you to know that they are jerks. They have no empathy, and ultimately they are assholes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, he's had first-hand experiences with several, Rodney Alcala being one, as discussed in this conversation. And it seems like Alcala, that trial lasted a long time, because Alcala defended himself and put the other side through hell because of delays and things like that, not to mention the families. But yeah, I mean, it was interesting. He mentioned, they're the first people to complain about how cold it is in the court. And they're just like narcissistic, arrogant assholes, all about them.
Yeah, everything has to be surrounding them. Everything has to revolve around them. And, ultimately that's what gets them caught.
Right. There's the blind spot. Exactly. All right, everyone. Well, thanks so much for listening to this conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. Pick up Matt's book, The Book of Murder, and look out for his new one coming, I don't know, probably next year. But thanks a lot for listening, everyone. We really appreciate it. Follow us on social media at Missing CSM.
I really need a sign off. If anybody has any suggestions for my final thought sign off, let me know.